The notification arrived at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, cutting through my sleep like a blade. My phone buzzed against the nightstand with an alert I'd programmed myself never expecting to need it. Fraud alert. Unusual spending pattern detected. Multiple, high-value transactions outside normal parameters. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I lay there in the darkness, David breathing steadily beside me, completely unaware that his financial house of cards was about to crumble thanks to the very systems I'd designed to protect us. The irony wasn't lost on me. As a senior risk analyst at Meridian Financial Services, I'd spent the last 8 years building sophisticated fraud detection algorithms, creating digital tripwires that could catch the smallest anomaly in spending patterns. What I never imagined was that I'd be using those same skills to catch my own husband funneling our money to his 24-year-old girlfriend at a boutique jewelry store in Scottsdale at nearly 4 a.m. But that's exactly what happened. And what David didn't know about the woman he'd been lying to for 6 months was that I don't just detect fraud for a living. I dismantle it, piece by piece, until there's nothing left but consequences. My name is Rachel Torres, and until that Tuesday morning in May, I thought I was living a fairly predictable life in our Ahwatukee home with my husband of 7 years. David ran a small but successful construction company called Desert Peak Construction, specializing in luxury pool installations across Phoenix's wealthier neighborhoods. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable. 2 incomes, no kids yet, a modest savings account, and what I believed was a solid marriage built on trust and shared goals. I should have known something was wrong months earlier. The signs were all there, glaring at me with the clarity that only hindsight provides. David's sudden interest in working late, his new habit of showering immediately when he came home, the way his phone had become practically grafted to his hand. But the thing about living with someone for 7 years is that you develop a kind of comfortable blindness to gradual changes. You explain away the inconsistencies because the alternative, that your entire life is built on a lie, is too devastating to contemplate. The first concrete sign came in March, though I didn't recognize it then. David announced he was taking on a big project in Scottsdale, a mansion with an infinity pool overlooking the McDowell Mountains. The timeline was tight, he explained, which meant longer days and working some weekends. The client was demanding but paying exceptionally well enough that we could finally start thinking about that trip to Italy we'd been planning for, our anniversary. I was actually proud of him. David had always been ambitious, and landing a high-end client like that felt like validation of all his hard work, building the company from nothing. I even helped him prepare for client meetings, choosing his best shirt, making sure his presentation materials were perfect. Looking back, I realize I was essentially helping him dress up for dates with Stephanie Walsh, though I wouldn't learn her name for another 2 months. The credit card situation started innocuously enough. David asked if he could add some business expenses to our personal cards temporarily, just until the client's first payment cleared. Cash flow, he explained, was tight with such a large project. It made sense. Construction often worked that way, with contractors fronting materials costs and labor before getting paid. I didn't think twice about it. What I didn't know was that David had already maxed out the company credit cards on what I would later discover were romantic getaways to Sedona, expensive dinners at restaurants I'd never heard of, and a custom jewelry shopping spree that would have made a professional athlete blush. By the time he asked to use our personal cards, he was already in deep, using our financial resources to fund a lifestyle with Stephanie that he could never afford on his actual income. My background in financial fraud should have made me more suspicious, but there's a difference between professional paranoia and personal trust. At work, I could spot irregular spending patterns across thousands of accounts in minutes. I could identify shell companies, trace money laundering schemes, and flag suspicious transactions with algorithmic precision. But at home, I was just a wife who trusted her husband when he said he needed help with business expenses. The sophisticated fraud protection system I'd set up on our accounts was originally meant to protect us from external threats. Identity thieves, skimmers, hackers, the usual suspects that keep financial security professionals awake at night. I'd programmed custom alerts for unusual spending patterns, geographic anomalies, and purchase categories that fell outside our normal habits. The system was so sensitive, it would flag anything from a gas purchase more than 50 miles from home to a restaurant bill over $100. What made the system particularly powerful was its machine learning capability. It had been analyzing our spending habits for 3 years, building a detailed profile of our financial behavior. It knew David typically bought gas on Tuesdays and Fridays. It knew I shopped for groceries on Sunday afternoons. It could predict with frightening accuracy when and where we would spend money, which made it extraordinarily good at detecting when someone was spending our money in ways that didn't fit our patterns. The irony was delicious in the most bitter way possible. David had been so careful about hiding his affair in every other aspect, creating fake work schedules, using a burner phone, even going so far as to change his cologne to something I wouldn't recognize on his clothes. But he'd completely overlooked the digital footprint he was creating with every swipe of our credit cards. Every romantic dinner, every weekend getaway, every piece of expensive jewelry was being meticulously documented and analyzed by systems I'd built to protect us. The breaking point came on that Tuesday in May, though the foundation had been cracking for weeks. I'd been getting intermittent alerts about unusual spending patterns, but they were always just barely within the parameters I'd set. A dinner that was expensive, but not impossibly so. A purchase at a store we'd never shopped at before, but in a category that wasn't completely foreign. David had either gotten very good at staying just under my radar, or someone was advising him on how to avoid detection. I later learned it was the latter. Stephanie, despite being 24 and working as a sales associate at a high-end boutique, had a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of financial systems. Her previous boyfriend, according to the private investigator I would eventually hire, had been a financial advisor who'd taught her quite a bit about money management and, apparently, money manipulation. She'd been coaching David on how to structure his spending to avoid triggering obvious red flags. But they made one critical mistake. They assumed that because I worked in fraud detection for a bank, my personal systems would be similar to the relatively simple consumer protections most people have on their accounts. They had no idea I'd essentially turned our credit cards into a laboratory for advanced financial security research, with monitoring capabilities that would make federal agencies envious. The specific transaction that finally triggered the major alert was a charge for $3,700 at Cartwright & Sons Fine Jewelry in Scottsdale at 3:42 a.m. on a Tuesday. The purchase itself was suspicious enough. We'd never bought anything at a jewelry store that expensive, and certainly not in the middle of the night. But what really caught the system's attention was the pattern of smaller transactions leading up to it. Dinner at a restaurant in Scottsdale the previous Friday. Flowers delivered to an address that wasn't our home the week before. A hotel charge in Sedona that coincided with a weekend David claimed to be working overtime on site. Individually, each transaction might have been explainable. Collectively, they painted a picture that my fraud detection algorithms recognized immediately. Someone was using our accounts to fund a relationship that had nothing to do with our marriage. I lay in bed that Tuesday morning, staring at the alert on my phone, feeling a strange sense of clinical detachment. This was exactly the kind of case I dealt with at work every day, except usually I was helping some stranger piece together how their identity had been stolen or their accounts compromised. The methodology was the same. Gather evidence, trace patterns, build a timeline, but the emotional stakes were entirely different. David stirred beside me, reaching instinctively for his phone as he always did upon waking. I watched him check his messages, his face illuminated by the blue glow of the screen, looking for any sign of guilt or recognition. there was nothing. He scrolled through whatever texts or emails he'd received overnight with the same casual indifference he showed every morning. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. If he had any idea that his financial indiscretions had been detected, he was hiding it perfectly. The really devastating part wasn't just the money, though $3,000 for jewelry was certainly painful. It was the realization that this wasn't an impulse purchase or a moment of weakness. The transaction timestamp showed 3:42 a.m., which meant David had either been planning this purchase in advance, coordinating with the store for an after-hours transaction, or he'd been with Stephanie at that hour and they'd decided together to make this purchase. Either scenario suggested a level of intimacy and planning that went far beyond a casual affair. I got up quietly, leaving David still absorbed in his phone, and went to my home office. If I was going to handle this situation, I needed to approach it the same way I would approach any complex fraud case. Methodically, thoroughly, and with overwhelming evidence. Personal feelings could wait. First, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. My home office was set up like a smaller version of my workspace at Meridian Financial. 3 monitors, specialized software for financial analysis, and direct access to several databases that most people never knew existed. The advantage of working in financial security is that you learn how to trace money in ways that would surprise most people. Every transaction leaves digital fingerprints, and if you know where to look, you can reconstruct entire timelines of financial behavior. I started with our credit card statements, going back 6 months. What I found was a masterclass in gradual escalation. The spending had started small in December, an occasional dinner at a restaurant I didn't recognize, maybe $60 or $70. By January, there were regular purchases at a florist called Desert Blooms, always on the same day of the week, always for amounts between $40 and $60. February brought the first hotel charges, initially at mid-range places, but gradually increasing in luxury. March was when things accelerated significantly. The Scottsdale project David had told me about coincided with a dramatic increase in spending at high-end restaurants, boutique stores, and weekend getaways. The pattern was so clear that my fraud detection software would have flagged it immediately if I'd been monitoring these accounts the same way I monitored accounts at work. But the most damning evidence was the geographic clustering. Every unusual transaction was happening in or around Scottsdale, particularly in the Fashion Square area and the surrounding luxury shopping district. David's actual construction projects, the legitimate ones I could verify through his business records, were scattered across Phoenix and the surrounding suburbs. There was no business reason for him to be spending time or money in Scottsdale with this kind of frequency. By the time David left for work that morning, claiming he'd be late again because of client meetings, I had 6 months of detailed financial evidence documenting what was obviously an ongoing affair. But evidence was just the beginning. If I was going to handle this properly, I needed to understand who I was dealing with, what I was up against, and how to ensure that when I finally confronted this situation, I would be in complete control. The woman who had been systematically helped drain our accounts wasn't some random person David had met in a bar. The sophistication of the spending pattern, the careful timing of transactions, the gradual escalation, all of it suggested someone who understood how financial monitoring worked and was actively trying to avoid detection. This wasn't just an affair. This was a calculated financial relationship, and I needed to understand exactly what Stephanie Walsh's role was in it. As I prepared for what would become the most methodical investigation of my career, I felt a strange sense of professional satisfaction mixed with personal devastation. David had chosen to betray our marriage, but he'd made one critical error. He'd tried to defraud someone who spent her days catching people exactly like him. The hunt was about to begin, and I had every intention of being the predator rather than the prey. The first thing I needed was professional help, but not the kind most betrayed spouses seek. I didn't need a therapist or a divorce attorney, at least not yet. I needed someone who could help me build an airtight case using methods that would hold up under legal scrutiny. That's why I called my brother Marcus Chen on Wednesday morning, exactly 24 hours after the jewelry store alert had shattered my world. Marcus worked as a cybersecurity consultant for major corporations, specializing in digital forensics and data recovery. More importantly, he understood the intersection between technology and human behavior in ways that would prove invaluable for what I was planning. We'd always been close, despite the fact that he lived in Tempe and traveled constantly for work. He was the kind of person who could find digital breadcrumbs that others didn't even know existed. I need your help with something sensitive, I told him over coffee at a small cafe near Arizona State University, far enough from both our usual haunts to ensure privacy. And I need you to promise me that what I'm about to share stays between us until I decide how to handle it. Marcus studied my face with the same analytical intensity he brought to his professional work. We'd grown up together in a household where both our parents were engineers, which meant we'd both inherited a tendency to approach problems systematically, rather than emotionally. It was a trait that had served us both well in our careers, and now it was going to serve me in ways I'd never anticipated. David's having an affair, I continued, watching Marcus's expression shift from curiosity to concern. And he's been using our credit cards to finance it for at least 6 months. I've got the financial evidence, but I need to understand the full scope of what I'm dealing with before I make any decisions about how to proceed. What I didn't tell Marcus immediately was that I was already 3 steps ahead of where most people would be in this situation. While he was absorbing the basic facts of David's betrayal, I was already thinking about surveillance patterns, digital footprints, and the kind of comprehensive intelligence gathering that would give me complete control over the situation when I finally chose to act. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting into the focused concentration I recognized from our childhood when he was solving complex puzzles. What kind of help are you looking for exactly? Because if you're thinking about confronting him, you'll want to make sure you have documentation that can't be disputed or explained away. That was exactly what I was thinking, but my goals extended far beyond a simple confrontation. I needed to understand not just what David had been doing, but who he was doing it with, how long it had been going on, and most importantly, what other surprises might be waiting for me. Financial infidelity often came with other forms of deception, and I couldn't afford to be blindsided by revelations I hadn't anticipated. I need a complete digital profile, I explained. Phone records, social media activity, location data, email patterns, everything that can be legally obtained and would help me understand the full timeline and scope of his activities. Marcus nodded slowly. That's definitely doable, especially if you have access to shared accounts and devices. What about the other person? Do you know who she is? I pulled out my phone and showed him the information I'd already gathered about Stephanie Walsh. It wasn't much yet, her name from the jewelry store transaction, her age from a quick social media search, and her workplace at a boutique called Mirage in Scottsdale Fashion Square. But it was enough to start building a more complete picture. Stephanie Walsh, 24, works in luxury retail, I said. The spending patterns suggest someone who's either financially sophisticated or getting advice from someone who is. She's not just along for the ride, she's actively participating in the financial aspects of this relationship. What I'd discovered about Stephanie in my preliminary research was troubling in ways that went beyond the obvious betrayal. Her social media presence was carefully curated, showing an expensive lifestyle that didn't align with her retail salary. Designer handbags, luxury vacations, jewelry that cost more than most people made in a month. Either she had family money, which seemed unlikely given her background, or she'd been in relationships with financially generous men before David. Marcus was already taking notes on his phone, his mind clearly shifting into professional mode. I can start with social media analysis and cross-reference it with location data if you can get me access to David's phone or computer. But Rachel, I have to ask, what's your endgame here? Because gathering this kind of information suggests you're planning something more complex than just filing for divorce. Oh, he was right, of course. I was planning something more complex, though I wasn't entirely sure what yet. What I knew was that David had made a series of calculated decisions to betray our marriage and steal our money to fund his relationship with another woman. Simply divorcing him and splitting assets wouldn't address the broader injustice of what he'd done, nor would it ensure that there were meaningful consequences for his actions. I'm planning to make sure that when this is over, there are appropriate consequences for everyone involved, I said carefully. David violated our marriage and our financial partnership. Stephanie participated in defrauding our accounts. I want to make sure they both understand the full cost of their choices. The conversation with Marcus established the foundation for what would become the most comprehensive investigation I'd ever undertaken. By the time we finished our coffee, we had a detailed plan for gathering information that would give me complete situational awareness before I took any direct action. The next step was understanding Stephanie's role more thoroughly, which meant I needed to observe her in her natural environment. That's how I found myself at Scottsdale Fashion Square on Thursday afternoon, ostensibly shopping for a friend's birthday gift, but actually conducting surveillance on the woman who had been systematically helping my husband drain our bank accounts. Mirage was exactly the kind of upscale boutique that attracted women who viewed shopping as a competitive sport. Designer clothes, accessories, and jewelry displayed like art pieces, with price tags that served as much as status symbols as the items themselves. The kind of place where spending $1,000 on a handbag was considered reasonable, and where the sales associates were trained to identify and cultivate wealthy clients. Stephanie was easy to spot. She matched the photos I'd found on social media, but seeing her in person provided context that digital images couldn't convey. She moved through the store with the confidence of someone who belonged in that environment, helping clients select items that cost more than most people's monthly salaries. Her own outfit, a silk blouse, tailored pants, and shoes that I recognized as designer, suggested either exceptional employee discounts or additional income sources. I spent 45 minutes in the store, pretending to browse while observing Stephanie's interactions with customers and colleagues. What I noticed was her particular skill at reading people, identifying which clients had money and which were just looking. She wasn't just a sales associate, she was a student of human nature, someone who understood how to identify and exploit weaknesses. When she approached me to offer assistance, I had my first direct interaction with the woman who had been participating in the systematic destruction of my marriage. Her smile was professional but warm, her questions about what I was looking for probing but not invasive. She was good at her job, I had to admit. Very good at making people feel understood and valued while simultaneously encouraging them to spend money they probably couldn't afford. "Are you shopping for anything specific today?" she asked, her voice carrying the kind of practiced charm that probably made her very successful at separating clients from their money. "Just browsing," I replied, studying her face for any sign that she might recognize me. "My husband mentioned this place as somewhere I might find something special for a friend's birthday." It was a calculated comment, designed to gauge her reaction to the mention of a husband. Most people would show no reaction at all to such a casual reference. But I caught something, a slight tightening around her eyes, a momentary pause before responding. It was subtle, but I'd spent years reading micro-expressions as part of my fraud detection work. Stephanie Walsh had reacted to the mention of my husband in a way that suggested the concept of married men was not abstract to her. "We do have some beautiful pieces that make wonderful gifts," she said smoothly, recovering quickly from whatever had caused her initial reaction. "What's your price range?" I allowed her to show me several items, using the interaction to assess her personality and methods. She was skilled at reading financial cues, quickly identifying that I could afford higher-end pieces and adjusting her recommendations accordingly. More concerning was her apparent comfort with moral ambiguity. When I mentioned that my husband would probably prefer I didn't spend too much, she suggested several ways to work around that concern, including payment plans that wouldn't show up as large single charges. The interaction confirmed my suspicions. Stephanie wasn't just passively accepting expensive gifts from David. She was actively strategizing about how to maximize financial benefit while minimizing detection. This wasn't a young woman who had stumbled into an affair with a married man. This was someone who understood exactly what she was doing and was approaching it with calculated precision. After leaving Mirage, I drove to a coffee shop in Old Town Scottsdale and called Nicole Park, my closest friend and a fellow financial services professional who worked as a private banker for high-net-worth clients. Nicole had access to information and resources that would be crucial for the next phase of my investigation. I need advice about a delicate situation, I told her over the phone, and I need someone I can trust to help me navigate some complex financial issues. Nicole and I had known each other since graduate school, where we'd both studied financial analysis and risk management. She was one of the few people who understood both the technical aspects of my work and the personal principles that drove my career choices. More importantly, she had connections throughout Phoenix's financial community that could provide insights I couldn't access through official channels. We met that evening at a wine bar in Central Phoenix, far enough from both our professional circles to ensure privacy. I gave Nicole a condensed version of what I'd discovered, focusing on the financial aspects rather than the emotional betrayal. As I'd expected, her response was immediate outrage on my behalf, followed by professional curiosity about the mechanics of what David and Stephanie had been doing. "How much money are we talking about?" Nicole asked, her banker's instincts, immediately focusing on the practical implications. "At least $15,000 over 6 months, I replied. "Possibly more, depending on what I find when I complete the full analysis. But it's not just the amount. It's the systematic nature of it, and the fact that someone was coaching him on how to avoid detection." Nicole's expression darkened. She'd seen enough financial fraud in her career to recognize the pattern I was describing. Someone with financial training helped plan this. The gradual escalation, the timing of transactions, the careful structuring to avoid triggering alerts. That's not accidental. Your husband had help. That confirmed what I'd suspected, but hadn't wanted to acknowledge. David wasn't smart enough to have orchestrated this level of financial deception on his own. Someone with knowledge of fraud detection systems had been advising him, which meant Stephanie's background was more complex than her job at a boutique suggested. "I need to understand who I'm really dealing with," I told Nicole. "And I need to know what other financial surprises might be waiting for me. If they've been this systematic about the credit cards, what else might they have accessed?" Nicole leaned forward, her expression serious. "Have you checked your credit reports? Verified that no new accounts have been opened in your name? Confirmed that your investment accounts and retirement funds haven't been touched?" I felt a chill run down my spine. In my focus on the credit card fraud, I hadn't considered the possibility that David might have attempted other forms of financial manipulation. With access to personal information and joint financial accounts, he could potentially have done far more damage than just maxing out credit cards. "I'll check everything tonight," I said. "But Nicole, I need you to help me with something else. I need to understand Stephanie Walsh's financial background. Someone doesn't go from retail sales to orchestrating sophisticated fraud overnight. There's more to her story." Nicole nodded, already understanding what I was asking. As a private banker, she had access to financial networks and databases that could provide insights into someone's credit history, account relationships, and financial patterns. It wasn't information that would be available to the general public, but it was accessible to financial professionals under the right circumstances. "I can make some inquiries," she said carefully. "But Rachel, what are you planning to do with all this information? Because gathering intelligence is one thing, but using it for retaliation could create legal problems for you. It was a fair question, and one I'd been considering since the moment I'd decided to investigate rather than simply confront. What I was planning wasn't retaliation in the traditional sense. It was strategic response designed to ensure appropriate consequences for systematic fraud and betrayal. I'm planning to make sure that when this situation resolves, justice is served, I replied. David and Stephanie made calculated decisions to defraud our accounts and destroy our marriage. I'm going to make sure they face calculated consequences that match the severity of their actions. Nicole studied my face, recognizing the professional determination that had made me successful in fraud detection. You're not just planning to leave him, are you? You're planning something more comprehensive. She was right. Leaving David would address the personal betrayal, but it wouldn't address the financial fraud or ensure that there were meaningful consequences for Stephanie's participation. What I was planning was a comprehensive response that would demonstrate the full cost of their choices while ensuring that I emerged from the situation in the strongest possible position. The rest of the evening was spent planning the investigation phase of my response. Nicole would use her banking connections to research Stephanie's financial background and identify any patterns that might explain her sophistication with fraud techniques. Marcus would conduct digital forensics on David's devices and accounts to establish a complete timeline of the affair and identify any other potential financial irregularities. Meanwhile, I would continue my own analysis of our financial accounts while simultaneously gathering intelligence on both David and Stephanie's activities, relationships, and vulnerabilities. By the time I was ready to act, I would have comprehensive knowledge of everyone involved and complete control over the timing and nature of my response. As I drove home that night, I felt a sense of professional satisfaction that was entirely separate from the personal devastation of discovering my husband's betrayal. This was the kind of complex, multi-layered fraud case that I'd built my career on solving. The only difference was that this time, the stakes were personal, and the resolution would be designed not just to stop the fraud, but to ensure that everyone involved understood the full consequences of their choices. David was home when I arrived, sitting in front of the television with a beer, looking relaxed and content. He greeted me with a casual kiss and asked about my day as though nothing had changed. His performance was flawless, giving no indication that he was living a double life or had any awareness that his carefully constructed deception was about to be systematically dismantled. "How was the Scottsdale project today?" I asked, settling beside him on the couch and adopting the same casual tone he was using. "Good," he replied without hesitation. "Long day, but we're making progress. Should wrap up in another couple of weeks." It was a lie told with such casual confidence that I almost admired his skill. If I hadn't known better, I would have believed him completely. But now I knew better, and every lie he told was simply additional evidence in the case I was building against him. That night, after David fell asleep, I began the comprehensive financial audit that would reveal the full scope of what I was dealing with. Credit reports, bank statements, investment accounts, retirement funds, everything that could potentially have been compromised by someone with access to our personal and financial information. What I found was both better and worse than I'd expected. Better because the fraud appeared to be limited to our credit cards and didn't extend to our more significant assets. Worse because the systematic nature of the credit card fraud was even more sophisticated than I'd initially realized. The pattern of transactions had been carefully designed not just to avoid detection, but to maximize the amount of money that could be extracted before I noticed anything unusual. By 3 a.m, I had a complete picture of the financial fraud and a clear understanding of the intelligence and planning that had gone into it. David and Stephanie had been systematic, patient, and strategic in their approach. Unfortunately for them, they'd chosen to defraud someone who was even more systematic, patient, and strategic in her response. The investigation phase was nearly complete, Soon, it would be time to move from gathering intelligence to taking action. And when that time came, I intended to demonstrate that fraud, like every other crime, carries consequences that match the sophistication of the offense. But the breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Marcus had been analyzing David's digital footprint for 3 days when he discovered something that changed everything I thought I knew about the situation. It wasn't just about the affair or even the financial fraud. David and Stephanie were planning something much more ambitious, and I had accidentally positioned myself to stop it before it could destroy not just my marriage, but my entire financial future. "You need to see this," Marcus said, calling me at work on Monday morning. His voice carried an urgency that made my stomach clench with anticipation. "Can you meet me for lunch? And Rachel, bring whatever legal documentation you have about your joint assets and David's business." I left Meridian Financial at noon, telling my supervisor I had a family emergency that required immediate attention. It wasn't entirely a lie. What Marcus had discovered would certainly qualify as an emergency, though not the kind most people would expect. We met at a small restaurant in Tempe, far enough from both our professional environments to ensure complete privacy. Marcus had brought his laptop and a folder thick with printouts, his expression grim in a way that prepared me for revelations I wasn't going to enjoy hearing. "I found their communication platform," he began without preamble. "They've been using an encrypted messaging app that automatically deletes conversations after 24 hours. But David made a critical mistake. He backed up his phone to the cloud last week, and the backup captured some messages before they were deleted." Marcus opened his laptop and showed me screenshots of conversations between David and Stephanie that revealed planning far more sophisticated than simple adultery. They weren't just having an affair funded by my credit cards. They were systematically preparing to liquidate assets and disappear together, leaving me responsible for debts and obligations I knew nothing about. "Look at this conversation from last Tuesday," Marcus said, pointing to a message thread that made my blood run cold. "David's telling Stephanie about your fraud detection systems and asking for advice on how to access retirement accounts without triggering alerts." The messages revealed that Stephanie had been researching my professional background, understanding my capabilities, and helping David develop strategies to circumvent the very security measures I'd designed to protect us. She'd been studying me like a case study, learning my patterns and weaknesses while maintaining the pretense of being just another retail employee. But the most devastating revelation was their timeline. According to the messages Marcus had recovered, David and Stephanie were planning to execute their final phase within 2 weeks. David would liquidate our joint investment accounts, transfer the funds to offshore accounts Stephanie had helped him establish, and then both of them would disappear to a country without extradition treaties with the United States. "He's been transferring small amounts to establish the offshore accounts," Marcus explained, showing me banking records he'd uncovered through his digital forensics work. "Nothing large enough to trigger automatic reporting requirements, but consistent, enough to build substantial balances over time." I stared at the evidence spread across the table, feeling a mixture of professional admiration for the sophistication of their scheme and personal fury at the magnitude of their betrayal. This wasn't just marital infidelity. This was premeditated. Financial destruction designed to leave me with nothing while they started a new life funded by assets we'd built together over 7 years of marriage. "How much money are we talking about?" I asked, though I was afraid to hear the answer. Marcus consulted his notes. "Based on what I can trace, they've already moved about $40,000 to offshore accounts. But Rachel, your joint investment accounts have over $300,000, and David has signatory authority on all of them." The scope of their planned theft was breathtaking. They intended to steal our entire financial future, leaving me not just divorced but financially devastated. Worse, because David had legal access to the accounts as my spouse, much of what they were planning might not even be technically illegal until after the fact. "There's something else," Marcus continued, his expression growing even more serious. Stephanie's background isn't what it appears to be. Nicole's banking contacts found some interesting information about her financial history. He handed me a folder containing Nicole's research on Stephanie Walsh. What I read fundamentally changed my understanding of who I was dealing with. Stephanie wasn't just a retail employee who had stumbled into an affair with a married man. She was a professional. This was what she did for a living. According to Nicole's research, Stephanie had been involved in similar schemes at least twice before. Her previous relationship had been with a divorced executive from Denver who discovered too late that she'd been systematically draining his accounts while they dated. Before that, she'd been linked to a businessman in California whose company had mysteriously lost significant funds to offshore accounts before she disappeared from his life. "She's a financial predator," I said, absorbing the implications of what I was reading. "She targets men with assets, builds relationships with them, and then orchestrates systematic theft." Marcus nodded grimly. "And David walked right into her trap. She probably identified him as a target months before they ever met. This isn't a love affair. It's a long-term financial crime, and your husband is both an accomplice and a victim." The revelation reframed everything I thought I understood about the situation. David wasn't just an unfaithful husband who had fallen for a younger woman. He was being manipulated by someone who had studied his weaknesses and designed a comprehensive strategy to exploit them. That didn't excuse his choices or reduce the betrayal, but it explained the sophistication of their methods and the ambitious scope of their plans. "What's our timeline?" I asked, shifting into the strategic thinking mode that had served me throughout my career. "How long do we have before they execute their plan?" Marcus checked his notes. "Based on their messages, they're planning to make the major transfers next Friday. That gives us 10 days to develop and implement a counter-strategy. 10 days to prevent the destruction of everything I'd worked to build over the past decade. 10 days to turn the tables on people who had underestimated the woman they were trying to defraud. 10 days to demonstrate that choosing me as a target was the worst mistake they could have made." I spent the rest of the lunch meeting with Marcus developing a comprehensive strategy that would not only prevent David and Stephanie from stealing our assets, but would ensure they faced serious consequences for what they'd already done. The plan required precise timing, careful coordination, and the same kind of strategic thinking that had made me successful in detecting and preventing financial fraud throughout my career. The first element was defensive. I needed to protect our assets without alerting David to the fact that I knew about his plans. That meant working with Nicole to restructure our accounts in ways that would prevent unauthorized transfers while maintaining the appearance that nothing had changed. The second element was offensive. I needed to gather evidence that would not only prove their conspiracy, but would also demonstrate the scope of their intended theft in ways that would satisfy both civil and criminal courts. That meant documenting everything, creating an unbreakable chain of evidence, and timing my revelations for maximum impact. The third element was personal. David had chosen to betray our marriage and steal our future. Stephanie had chosen to make me a target for financial predation. Both of them would learn that such choices carry consequences that match the magnitude of their crimes. I returned to work that afternoon energized by having a clear plan and a defined timeline. For the first time since discovering David's betrayal, I felt like I was in control of the situation rather than simply reacting to revelations. I was done being a victim. It was time to become the predator. The first step was implementing the defensive measures that would protect our assets. I called Nicole from my office and arranged to meet her that evening to restructure our financial accounts in ways that would prevent David from accessing them while maintaining plausible deniability about my knowledge of his plans. "I need to protect $300,000 in investment accounts without making it obvious that I know what David is planning," I explained when we met at her office after normal business hours. Nicole had already prepared several options based on our earlier conversations. The cleanest approach is to restructure the accounts to require dual authorization for any transfers over $10,000. We can frame it as enhanced security measures in response to increased fraud in the financial sector. It was perfect. The changes would prevent David from executing his planned theft while giving him no reason to suspect that I knew about his intentions. Better yet, any attempts he made to circumvent the new security measures would create additional evidence of his fraudulent intent. We spent 2 hours that evening implementing security measures that would make it impossible for David to access our major assets without my explicit approval. Every account was restructured, every transfer protocol modified, every security measure enhanced. By the time we finished, our financial assets were protected by layers of security that would stop any unauthorized access while documenting every attempt. The next phase required more delicate timing. I needed to gather evidence of David and Stephanie's conspiracy while positioning myself to catch them in the act of attempting their final theft. That meant allowing them to believe their plan was proceeding normally, while ensuring that every step they took was documented and could be used against them later. Marcus had provided me with monitoring software that would track David's digital activities without his knowledge. Every email, every message, every financial transaction would be recorded and time-stamped, creating an unbreakable record of their conspiracy. More importantly, the software would alert me in real time to any attempts to access our protected accounts, allowing me to catch them in the act of attempted theft. The psychological aspect of my strategy was perhaps the most important element. David and Stephanie had succeeded in their previous schemes because their victims had been caught off guard, reacting emotionally rather than strategically to the discovery of betrayal. I intended to do exactly the opposite. When they realized their plan had failed, I would be prepared for their responses, ready to counter their moves, and positioned to ensure they faced maximum consequences for their actions. Wednesday evening brought the first test of my defensive measures. David arrived home with flowers and an expensive bottle of wine, more affectionate than he'd been in months. His sudden attentiveness would have been touching if I hadn't known it was part of his strategy to keep me unsuspecting while he finalized his theft of our assets. "I thought we could have a nice dinner together," he said, kissing me with what seemed like genuine warmth. "It feels like we haven't spent enough quality time lately." I played my part perfectly, accepting his attention while mentally cataloging every detail of his performance. The flowers were from the same shop where he'd been buying arrangements for Stephanie. The wine was a vintage he'd never shown interest in before, but which appeared frequently in his expense reports for romantic dinners with his mistress. Even his sudden interest in spending time with me followed a pattern Marcus had identified in his communications with Stephanie about maintaining his cover story. "This is lovely," I said, allowing him to pour wine and serve dinner as though we were still the happily married couple we'd pretended to be for months. "What's the occasion?" "No occasion," David replied smoothly. "I just realized I've been taking you for granted lately. Work's been stressful, and I haven't been the husband you deserve." The irony was delicious. He was apologizing for taking me for granted while actively planning to steal everything we'd built together and disappear with another woman. His performance was so convincing that if I hadn't known the truth, I might have been genuinely moved by his apparent recognition of his shortcomings. We spent the evening talking about our future together, our plans for travel, our goals for the next few years. David spoke with apparent sincerity about growing old together, about the family we might start, about the dreams we shared. All of it was lies designed to keep me compliant while he finalized preparations to destroy our life together. But I played my part equally well, responding with the warmth and trust of a wife who had no idea her husband was planning to betray her in the most comprehensive way possible. Every smile, every laugh, every affectionate gesture was calculated to maintain his confidence, while I positioned myself for the devastating counterattack I was preparing. Thursday brought confirmation that our security measures were working, exactly as intended. Marcus called me at work with news that David had attempted to access our investment accounts the previous night. only to be blocked by the enhanced security protocols we'd implemented. He tried 3 different approaches, Marcus reported. First, he attempted a direct transfer using his normal access credentials. When that failed, he tried to modify the account settings to remove the dual authorization requirement. When that didn't work, he attempted to contact the investment company directly to authorize a transfer over the phone. Each failed attempt had been documented by our monitoring systems, creating a detailed record of David's fraudulent intent. More importantly, his increasingly desperate attempts to access the accounts suggested that his timeline was accelerating. Whatever he and Stephanie had planned was happening soon, and they were running out of time to implement their strategy. Did he succeed in accessing anything? I asked. Nothing significant, Marcus assured me. The security measures held completely, but Rachel, his pattern of attempts suggests they're getting desperate. I think they're going to try something more aggressive soon. That evening, David's behavior confirmed Marcus's assessment. He was distracted during dinner, checking his phone constantly and showing signs of stress that he was trying unsuccessfully to hide. When I asked about his day, his responses were shorter and less detailed than usual. Something was clearly wrong with his plans, and he was struggling to maintain his normal demeanor. "Everything okay?" I asked, feigning concern while internally celebrating the success of our defensive measures. "Just work stuff," he replied tersely. "Some complications?" "With client payments. Nothing I can't handle." It was another lie, but this one revealed more than he intended. David was beginning to realize that his carefully planned theft wasn't going as smoothly as he'd expected. The security measures were working, his timeline was compressed, and he was starting to panic about his ability to execute the final phase of his conspiracy with Stephanie. Friday morning brought the call I'd been expecting. Nicole contacted me early to report that David had attempted to contact our investment company directly, claiming there was an emergency that required immediate access to our accounts. He told them you were in a medical emergency and needed funds transferred immediately for treatment, Nicole explained. It was actually a sophisticated approach that might have worked with a less security-conscious institution. But it didn't work? Not even close. The enhanced security protocols we implemented require in-person verification for any emergency. Access requests. They told David he would need to appear in person with you and proper documentation before any exceptions could be made to normal procedures. The failed attempt was perfect evidence of David's fraudulent intent. He'd explicitly attempted to steal our money using false pretenses, and every detail of his attempt had been documented by the investment company's security procedures. When the time came to present evidence of his conspiracy, this attempt alone would be enough to demonstrate criminal intent. That evening, David didn't come home. He called around 8 o'clock to say he was working late on a difficult client situation and would probably spend the night at the office rather than driving home exhausted. It was the first time in our marriage that he'd stayed away overnight, without advance notice, and it confirmed that his plans were reaching their final phase. I used his absence to implement the final elements of my strategy. Working with Marcus and Nicole, I activated monitoring systems that would track David's every movement, document every financial transaction he attempted, and alert law enforcement if he tried to leave the country. By morning, we would have complete surveillance coverage of both David and Stephanie, ensuring that when they made their final move, we would be ready to stop them and document everything for the legal proceedings that would follow. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of desert clarity that made Phoenix beautiful despite its harsh climate. I woke early, checked all our security systems, and confirmed that everything was in place for what I expected would be the final confrontation with David and Stephanie's conspiracy. The monitoring systems showed that David had spent the night at a hotel in Scottsdale, the same hotel where he and Stephanie had been meeting for their romantic getaways. Phone records indicated they'd been in constant communication since his failed attempt to access our accounts, and their conversations suggested they were preparing to implement some kind of backup plan. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing Clothes that projected professional confidence while remaining practical for whatever the day might bring. I checked my phone to ensure all alert systems were active, confirmed that Marcus and Nicole were ready to provide support if needed, and prepared myself mentally for the confrontation that would determine whether justice would be served or whether David and Stephanie would succeed in destroying everything I'd worked to build. The first alert came at 10:30. David was attempting to access our accounts again, this time using a different approach that suggested he'd received new advice about circumventing security protocols. The attempt failed, but it triggered our monitoring systems, and confirmed that the final phase of his conspiracy was beginning. I was ready. After 6 days of strategic preparation, comprehensive investigation, and careful positioning, I had complete control over the situation and total awareness of my opponent's capabilities and intentions. David and Stephanie had chosen to make me a target for their financial predation. They were about to learn that was the worst mistake they could have made. The second alert arrived at 11:15, followed by a third at 11:43. David was becoming increasingly aggressive in his attempts to bypass our security measures, each failed effort more desperate than the last. The monitoring software Marcus had installed was documenting every keystroke, every failed password attempt, every unsuccessful effort to circumvent the protections I'd put in place. By noon, we had created an unbreakable digital paper trail of attempted financial fraud that would satisfy any prosecutor. My phone buzzed with a text message from David. "Hey babe, having some issues with our investment account. Can you call them and authorize a transfer I need for the business? It's urgent." The casual tone couldn't disguise the desperation behind the request. He was asking me to personally authorize the very theft he'd been trying to execute without my knowledge. I responded exactly as an unsuspecting wife would. "Of course. How much do you need? Is everything okay with the business?" The performance was crucial. David needed to believe I was still completely unaware of his conspiracy, while I maneuvered him into a position where his crimes would be undeniable. His response came quickly. $50,000 to start. Client payment delays are creating cash flow problems. I'll explain everything when I get home tonight. $50,000 as a starting point, when his real plan involved stealing our entire financial future. He was testing my willingness to cooperate, probably hoping to escalate the requests, once I'd demonstrated compliance with the initial theft. Instead of calling the investment company, I called Marcus. "He's making his move. David just asked me to authorize a $50,000 transfer for supposed business purposes. I think they're implementing their backup plan." Marcus's voice carried the focused intensity I'd come to associate with him when he was solving complex problems. "Perfect. This gives us exactly what we need. If you authorize a small transfer, he'll think the security measures aren't as comprehensive as they actually are. We can use his confidence against him." The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. By appearing to cooperate with David's initial request, I would encourage him to attempt progressively larger thefts, each one creating additional evidence of criminal intent. Meanwhile, the monitoring systems would document every step of his escalating fraud, building an unassailable case against both him and Stephanie. I called our investment company and authorized a transfer of exactly $50,000 to David's business account, but with specific conditions that he wasn't aware of. The transfer would be reversible for 72 hours. Every detail would be documented for potential legal proceedings, and any subsequent transfer requests would trigger immediate alerts to law enforcement. David's relief was palpable when I texted him confirmation that the transfer had been authorized. "You're amazing. Thank you for understanding. This will solve our cash flow problems completely." His gratitude would have been touching if I hadn't known he was expressing appreciation for my unwitting cooperation in his planned theft of our life savings. The afternoon brought a flurry of activity from both David and Stephanie. Phone records showed constant communication between them, and Marcus's monitoring systems detected multiple attempts to access additional accounts now that they believed they'd successfully circumvented our security measures. Each attempt was documented, creating a comprehensive record of their conspiracy. At 3:30, my phone rang with a call from Nicole. "Rachel, you need to know that David just contacted our bank asking about international wire transfer procedures. He specifically asked about transfers to offshore accounts and what documentation would be required for large amounts." The pieces were falling into place exactly as I'd anticipated. David believed his initial success with the $50,000 transfer meant he could now proceed with the larger theft he and Stephanie had planned. He had no idea that every move he made was being monitored and documented by systems designed specifically to catch people like him. "How long before he can actually initiate international transfers?" I asked. "With the security measures we've implemented, he can't do anything without your physical presence and biometric verification," Nicole assured me. "But the fact that he's asking suggests they're ready to attempt the final phase of their plan." I spent the rest of the afternoon at Meridian Financial, ostensibly working on routine fraud cases, but actually coordinating the final elements of my response to David and Stephanie's conspiracy. Every detail had to be perfect. When this was over, there could be no doubt about their guilt, no possibility of legal technicalities allowing them to escape consequences, and no chance of them attempting similar crimes against other victims. At 4:45, I received the call I'd been expecting. David's voice carried forced casualness that didn't quite hide his underlying tension. "Rachel, I hate to ask, but could you meet me at the bank tomorrow morning? There are some additional transfers I need to make for the business, and apparently the new security procedures require both of us to be present." Tomorrow was Sunday, which meant David had arranged for special weekend access to our accounts. The level of planning involved confirmed that this wasn't an opportunistic crime, but a carefully orchestrated conspiracy that had been months in the making. "Of course," I replied, matching his casual tone while inwardly celebrating that he was voluntarily walking into the trap I'd prepared. "What time works for you?" 10 o'clock? I know it's early for a weekend, but I really need to get these transfers completed before Monday. The client situation is more urgent than I initially thought." 10 o'clock on Sunday morning would be perfect. The bank would be nearly empty. Providing privacy for what I expected would be a very dramatic conclusion to David's criminal conspiracy. More importantly, the weekend timing meant that law enforcement would have additional time to respond when David's attempted theft triggered the alerts I'd programmed into our security systems. That evening, David came home with an expensive bottle of champagne and an elaborate dinner from our favorite restaurant. His mood was celebratory, clearly anticipating the successful completion of his theft of our assets. He spoke enthusiastically about our future together, describing plans for renovating our house and taking the European vacation we'd discussed for years. "After tomorrow's business transfers clear, we'll have much more financial flexibility," he said, raising his champagne glass in a toast. "To our future together and the success of Desert Peak construction." I clinked my glass against his, matching his smile while thinking about the prison sentence he'd be facing once his crimes were fully documented. "To our future," I agreed, meaning something entirely different than what he imagined. The evening passed in surreal domestic normalcy. We watched a movie, shared dessert, and went to bed together as though we were still the happily married couple we'd once been. David fell asleep easily, his conscience apparently untroubled by his plans to destroy our marriage and steal our life savings. I lay awake beside him, reviewing every element of the strategy I would implement in less than 12 hours. Sunday. Morning arrived with the kind of perfect Arizona weather that made Phoenix attractive despite its summer heat. Clear skies, comfortable temperature, and unlimited visibility. Perfect conditions for the most important performance of my life. I dressed conservatively but professionally, choosing clothes that would photograph well for the media coverage I expected would follow David's arrest. Every detail mattered. When this story became public, I wanted to appear as the competent professional who had outsmarted sophisticated criminals, not as an emotional victim who had stumbled into accidentally preventing a crime. David was unusually attentive during breakfast, making conversation about our weekend plans and expressing appreciation for my willingness to help with his business banking needs. His performance was flawless, giving no indication that he was preparing to commit the most serious crime of his life. We arrived at the bank exactly at 10 o'clock. Nicole was waiting for us, along with two other bank officials I didn't recognize. The formal setup should have been David's first indication that something wasn't proceeding according to his expectations, but he seemed too focused on his planned theft to notice the unusual level of attention his routine business transfer was receiving. "Good morning," Nicole said formally, shaking both our hands with professional courtesy. "I understand you need to authorize some significant transfers this morning. We've prepared a private conference room where we can handle the necessary documentation." The conference room was equipped with recording equipment, security cameras, and direct communication links to law enforcement. Every word spoken, every document signed, every transfer attempted would be permanently documented for legal proceedings. David was voluntarily walking into a comprehensive evidence-gathering operation designed specifically to catch him in the act of committing financial fraud. "I appreciate you arranging weekend access," David said, settling into his chair with the confidence of someone who believed he was in complete control of the situation. "The transfer amounts are substantial, so I understand why the enhanced security procedures are necessary." Nicole consulted the documentation we'd prepared. "According to our records, you're requesting authorization for transfers totaling approximately $280,000 to various offshore accounts. Is that correct?" David's momentary surprise at the specific amount mentioned was quickly covered by a nod of confirmation. "Yes, that's correct. Complex international business arrangements requiring multiple account structures." His explanation was smooth but vague, exactly what you'd expect from someone attempting to disguise criminal activity as legitimate business. "And Mrs. Torres, you're comfortable authorizing transfers of this magnitude to accounts you've never accessed or controlled?" Nicole asked, looking directly at me with an expression that suggested she was asking for more than simple confirmation. This was the moment I'd been preparing for throughout the entire investigation. David's crime was about to be exposed, his conspiracy with Stephanie revealed, and his plans for financial theft documented beyond any possibility of denial. Everything depended on my response to Nicole's carefully worded question. "Actually," I said slowly, allowing my voice to carry the weight of someone making a difficult realization, "I'm not comfortable with any of this. David, these accounts, you're asking me to authorize transfers to. I've never heard of them before, and the amounts you're discussing are nearly our entire investment portfolio." David's face remained calm, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated increasing stress. "Rachel, we discussed this. The business opportunities I've been developing require substantial initial investments, but the returns will be significant." "Which business opportunities?" I asked, maintaining the tone of a confused wife seeking clarification rather than an investigator closing a trap. "You told me yesterday you needed $50,000 for client payment issues. Now you're talking about almost $300,000 for international investments I've never heard of." The room fell silent except for the nearly inaudible hum of recording equipment documenting every word. Nicole and the other bank officials watched the interaction with professional attention, ready to intervene if David attempted to coerce my cooperation or became threatening. David's response revealed the sophisticated manipulation techniques he'd learned from Stephanie. "Sweetheart, I know this seems sudden, but these opportunities have specific timing requirements. The initial $50,000 was just the beginning. The real potential requires larger investments, and the window for participation is closing rapidly." "What opportunities, David? Specifically?" I leaned forward, adopting the body language of someone seeking detailed information, rather than someone who already knew the truth. "If we're risking our entire financial future, I need to understand exactly what we're investing in." For the first time since I'd known him, David appeared genuinely uncertain about how to respond. His prepared explanations assumed my unquestioning cooperation, not detailed questioning about the specifics of his supposed business ventures. The silence stretched uncomfortably as he struggled to invent plausible details for fictional investments. Import-export opportunities, he finally said. Working with international partners to develop supply chains for construction materials. It's complex, but the profit margins are extraordinary. It was a reasonable-sounding explanation that would probably satisfy most people, but it had one critical flaw. David's construction company specialized in pool installation and had never been involved in international trade of any kind. His explanation was plausible enough to work with strangers, but completely inconsistent with his actual business history. "That's interesting," I said thoughtfully. "But David, Desert Peak Construction has always focused on local pool installation. When did you develop expertise in international supply chain management? And who are these international partners you're working with?" David's discomfort was becoming increasingly visible. He shifted in his chair, checked his phone unnecessarily, and showed other signs of stress that suggested he was beginning to realize his carefully planned theft wasn't proceeding as smoothly as he'd expected. "The opportunities developed through networking with other contractors," he said, his voice carrying less confidence than before. "Sometimes business growth requires expanding beyond traditional areas of expertise." Nicole chose that moment to interject with devastating precision. "Mr. Torres, our fraud prevention systems have been monitoring some unusual activity on your accounts that I think we should discuss before proceeding with any large transfers." The words hit David like a physical blow. His face went pale, and for the first time since entering the bank, he looked genuinely frightened. The mention of fraud prevention monitoring meant his carefully hidden activities had been discovered, documented, and analyzed by professionals who understood exactly what he'd been attempting to do. "What kind of unusual activity?" he asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer. Nicole opened a thick folder containing printouts of transaction records, phone logs, and digital communications that Marcus's investigation had uncovered. Systematic credit card fraud, attempts to bypass account security measures, unauthorized access attempts, and communications with known financial criminals regarding methods for stealing and transferring assets. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Months of systematic theft, documented attempts to circumvent security measures, and recorded conversations about stealing our assets and fleeing the country. David's face reflected the dawning realization that his criminal conspiracy had been discovered and thoroughly documented. "I think there's been some misunderstanding," he said weakly, but his voice carried no conviction. The evidence spread across the table told a story that couldn't be explained away by misunderstandings or innocent mistakes. "The only misunderstanding," I said quietly, finally abandoning any pretense of surprise or confusion, "is your assumption that I wouldn't notice when my own husband was systematically stealing our money to fund his relationship with another woman." David's shocked expression confirmed that he'd never suspected I knew about Stephanie, much less that I'd uncovered the full scope of their conspiracy. For months, he'd believed his performance as a loving husband was completely convincing. Never imagining that I'd been conducting a professional investigation into his activities. "Rachel, I can explain," he began, but I cut him off with a gesture. "You can explain to law enforcement," I replied calmly. "Nicole, I believe it's time to make those calls we discussed." The bank officials moved with practiced efficiency, activating protocols for financial crime cases that would ensure David's attempted theft was properly documented and reported to appropriate authorities. Within minutes, the conference room had been transformed from a private meeting space into a crime scene being professionally processed by experts in financial fraud. David sat in stunned silence as the full scope of his situation became clear. His planned theft had failed completely, his criminal conspiracy had been exposed, and his attempts to destroy our marriage and steal our future had resulted in nothing but evidence that would ensure his prosecution. Worse, from his perspective, Every detail of his crimes had been documented by systems I'd designed specifically to catch people like him. "How long have you known?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Long enough to make sure you'd face appropriate consequences for your choices," I replied. "David, did you really think you could defraud someone who detects fraud for a living?" The question hung in the air as law enforcement arrived to formally arrest David for financial crimes that carried substantial prison sentences. His perfectly planned theft had become a perfectly documented conviction, and his attempt to destroy our life together had resulted in nothing but the destruction of his own future. As David was led away in handcuffs, I felt a complex mixture of professional satisfaction and personal sadness. Justice had been served with the precision I'd promised myself when this investigation began, but the cost had been the complete destruction of a marriage I'd once believed was built on love and trust. The morning that had begun with David's confident expectation of stealing our life savings ended with his arrest for crimes that would result in years of imprisonment. His partnership with Stephanie Walsh had evolved from systematic theft to comprehensive prosecution, and their dreams of disappearing together with our money had become nightmares of legal consequences they'd never anticipated. I remained in the conference room as bank officials completed their documentation, thinking about the investigation that had brought us to this moment and the justice that had finally been served. David had made the mistake of choosing someone as his victim who possessed the knowledge, resources, and determination to ensure his crimes carried appropriate consequences. Now it was time to ensure that Stephanie Walsh faced similar justice for her role in the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed everything I'd worked to build. Stephanie Walsh was arrested 3 hours later at her apartment in Scottsdale, where federal agents found evidence that confirmed her role as the mastermind behind multiple financial fraud schemes spanning several years. Her laptop contained detailed profiles of previous victims, sophisticated strategies for bypassing security systems, and communications with other criminals operating similar operations across the southwestern United States. The arrest operation was coordinated by Detective Carmen Rodriguez of the Phoenix Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit, who had been investigating reports of systematic relationship fraud targeting wealthy individuals throughout Arizona. My case against David and Stephanie provided the breakthrough evidence she needed to connect multiple unsolved fraud cases to a broader criminal network. "Mrs. Torres, your documentation is the most comprehensive evidence package we've seen in a financial fraud case," Detective Rodriguez told me during our meeting at police headquarters the week after the arrests. "The systematic approach you took to gathering evidence has given us everything we need, not just for successful prosecution, but for connecting these defendants to other crimes they've committed." The scope of Stephanie's criminal enterprise was staggering. According to Detective Rodriguez's investigation, she had been operating sophisticated fraud schemes for at least 5 years, targeting men with substantial assets and systematically draining their accounts before disappearing. Her victims included a retired aerospace engineer in Tucson who lost over $400,000, a restaurant owner in Flagstaff whose business was destroyed by her theft of operational funds, and a Phoenix attorney whose reputation was ruined when she emptied his client trust accounts. "The pattern is always the same," Detective Rodriguez explained, showing me files from the other cases. "She identifies wealthy targets through social media and professional networking, builds romantic relationships designed to gain access to their financial information, and then systematically drains their accounts using techniques that suggest considerable knowledge of banking security systems." What made Stephanie particularly dangerous was her ability to manipulate her victims into willing participation in their own financial destruction. She didn't simply steal money, she convinced her targets to authorize transfers, bypass security measures, and even lie to financial institutions on her behalf. By the time they realized they'd been defrauded, she had disappeared with their assets and moved on to new victims in different locations. David wasn't her first married target, Detective Rodriguez continued. She specifically sought out men in committed relationships because their emotional vulnerability made them easier to manipulate, and their established financial histories gave her access to larger amounts of money. The investigation into Stephanie's background revealed a criminal sophistication that explained the elaborate nature of her conspiracy with David. She had studied psychology in college before dropping out to pursue what was essentially a career in financial predation. Her knowledge of human behavior, combined with technical training she'd received from previous criminal associates, made her extraordinarily effective at identifying and exploiting the weaknesses of her targets. The legal proceedings moved forward, with the efficiency that comprehensive evidence makes possible. David was charged with multiple felonies including financial fraud, conspiracy to commit theft, and attempted money laundering. Stephanie faced similar charges plus additional counts related to her previous victims and her role as the leader of the criminal conspiracy. David's attorney attempted to negotiate a plea agreement based on claims that he had been manipulated by Stephanie, but the evidence I had gathered demonstrated his willing and enthusiastic participation in planning the theft. The recorded conversations Marcus had recovered showed David actively strategizing about how to circumvent security measures and discussing methods for transferring stolen funds to offshore accounts. "Your husband wasn't a victim," the prosecutor explained during one of our preparation meetings. "The evidence shows he was a willing collaborator who understood exactly what he was doing and enthusiastically participated in planning sophisticated financial crimes." The trial began 6 months later, with media coverage that transformed the case into a cautionary tale about financial fraud in the digital age. Local news stations ran features about the importance of monitoring financial accounts, and national financial security organizations used my story as an example of how professional expertise could be applied to personal protection. My testimony as the primary witness was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. I spent 2 days on the witness stand explaining how my fraud detection systems had uncovered the conspiracy, how I had gathered evidence of their crimes, and how I had used my professional knowledge to protect our assets while documenting their criminal activities. "Mrs. Torres, you essentially conducted a professional investigation into your own husband's criminal activities," the prosecutor said during my testimony. "Can you explain to the jury why you chose that approach rather than simply confronting him when you first discovered his fraud?" "Professional experience taught me that financial criminals often have backup plans and hidden assets," I replied, addressing the jury directly. If I had confronted David immediately, he might have been able to execute alternative theft strategies or destroy evidence of his crimes. By conducting a thorough investigation first, I ensured that when he was finally caught, there would be no possibility of him escaping consequences or victimizing others. The defense attorney's attempts to portray David as a victim of manipulation were undermined by the recorded evidence of his enthusiastic participation in planning the theft. Audio recordings captured him discussing methods for bypassing security systems, expressing excitement about their planned escape to countries without extradition treaties, and strategizing about how to maximize the amount they could steal before I discovered their activities. Stephanie's trial revealed the full scope of her criminal enterprise and her role as a professional financial predator. Evidence presented by the prosecution showed that she had stolen over $2 million from various victims over 5 years, using increasingly sophisticated methods to avoid detection and prosecution. The defendant operated what can only be described as a criminal business, the prosecutor argued during closing statements. She systematically identified wealthy targets, manipulated them into romantic relationships, and then executed comprehensive theft of their assets using techniques that demonstrate extensive criminal sophistication. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges against both defendants. David was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. Stephanie received a 15-year sentence that reflected both the scope of her crimes and her role as the leader of the criminal conspiracy. During the sentencing hearing, I was given the opportunity to address the court about the impact of their crimes. I spoke not just about the financial damage they had attempted to cause, but about the broader implications of their systematic abuse of trust and their targeting of victims who had believed they were in loving relationships. Your Honor, these defendants didn't just attempt to steal money, I said, addressing the judge while David and Stephanie sat at the defense table avoiding eye contact. They systematically destroyed trust, manipulated emotions, and turned intimate relationships into weapons for financial predation. Their crimes represent a fundamental violation of the bonds that allow people to build lives together. The judge's response reflected understanding of the broader social damage caused by relationship fraud. The defendants' crimes strike at the foundation of personal relationships and financial security that our society depends on. The sentences imposed today reflect not just the financial harm they caused, but the systematic abuse of trust that made their crimes possible. The civil proceedings that followed the criminal convictions allowed me to recover the funds that had been stolen and secure additional compensation for the costs of investigation and legal representation. Stephanie's assets, including luxury items purchased with stolen money, were seized and liquidated to provide restitution to her various victims. More importantly, the comprehensive documentation I had gathered enabled law enforcement to identify and contact other victims who hadn't realized they had been systematically defrauded. Several people came forward with similar stories of financial manipulation, leading to additional charges and longer sentences for both defendants. The investigation also revealed that David's construction business had been failing for over a year before he met Stephanie. His apparent success and the financial stability I thought we shared had been carefully constructed illusions designed to hide his business failures and mounting debts. Meeting Stephanie hadn't corrupted an honest man. It had provided a failing businessman with criminal methods to solve his financial problems. I thought I knew him, I told Detective Rodriguez during one of our final meetings. 7 years of marriage, and I had no idea that the man I was living with was capable of systematic deception on this scale. That's what makes financial predators like Stephanie so dangerous, the detective replied. They don't just steal money. They teach their victims to become criminals themselves, turning honest people into willing participants in their own destruction. 6 months after the trials concluded, I received an unexpected visitor at my office at Meridian Financial. Tom Bradley, the private investigator who had assisted with gathering evidence for the criminal cases, brought news about Stephanie's criminal network that provided closure to aspects of the case I hadn't fully understood. We traced her activities back further than anyone initially realized, Tom explained, showing me files that detailed Stephanie's criminal career. She's been operating relationship fraud schemes since she was 19 years old. Your case was just the latest in a pattern that goes back almost a decade. The investigation had revealed that Stephanie was part of a loose network of criminals who shared information about techniques, targets, and methods for avoiding prosecution. Her laptop contained communications with similar criminals operating in other states, suggesting that relationship fraud was becoming an increasingly organized and sophisticated criminal enterprise. The good news is that your case has become a model for how to investigate and prosecute these crimes, Tom continued. Law enforcement agencies across the country are using your documentation methods as training examples for financial crime investigators. My professional reputation had been enhanced rather than damaged by the public attention surrounding the case. Meridian Financial promoted me to a senior position in their fraud prevention division, with specific responsibility for developing systems to detect relationship fraud and financial manipulation in intimate partnerships. The new position allowed me to channel my experience into protecting other potential victims. I developed training programs for financial institutions about recognizing signs of relationship fraud, created educational materials for the public about protecting assets in intimate relationships, and consulted with law enforcement agencies about investigating complex financial crimes. Marcus parlayed his role in the investigation into a consulting business specializing in digital forensics for personal protection. His expertise in monitoring systems and evidence gathering made him highly sought after by attorneys handling divorce cases and individuals who suspected they were being financially manipulated. Your case changed how people think about protecting themselves in relationships, Marcus told me when we met for dinner on the first anniversary of David's arrest. The comprehensive approach you took has become the gold standard for people who suspect financial infidelity. Nicole was promoted to senior vice president at her bank, with expanded responsibilities for developing security protocols that protect clients from various forms of financial manipulation. The systems we had designed to catch David and Stephanie became templates for enhanced security measures implemented by financial institutions throughout Arizona. The personal recovery was more complex than the professional success. Rebuilding life after discovering that a 7-year marriage had been built on systematic deception required more than just legal victories and career advancement. It required fundamentally reconsidering my understanding of trust, relationships, and the balance between professional skepticism and personal vulnerability. Therapy helped me process the emotional trauma of discovering that someone I had loved and trusted was willing to destroy our life together for financial gain. The betrayal wasn't just about money or infidelity. It was about the realization that the person I had shared my life with was capable of systematic cruelty that went far beyond simple selfishness. You handled an impossible situation with remarkable strength and intelligence, my therapist observed during one of our sessions. But don't underestimate the emotional impact of learning that someone you trusted was planning to systematically destroy everything you had built together. The healing process was gradual and ongoing. Some days I felt proud of how I had protected myself and ensured justice for David and Stephanie's crimes. Other days I struggled with questions about whether I had missed warning signs that should have been obvious to someone with my professional background. 2 years after the arrests, I began dating again, though with a much more systematic approach to evaluating potential partners. The experience with David had taught me that professional expertise in fraud detection needed to be balanced with appropriate caution in personal relationships. I also became involved in advocacy work, speaking at conferences about financial fraud prevention and consulting with organizations that support victims of relationship crimes. The comprehensive documentation I had created for David and Stephanie's prosecution became a model for other victims seeking justice in similar cases. Your story demonstrates that victims of financial fraud don't have to be passive, I told audiences at fraud prevention conferences. With the right knowledge and strategic approach, it's possible not just to protect yourself, but to ensure that criminals face appropriate consequences for their choices. The most satisfying aspect of the recovery was knowing that David and Stephanie's prosecution had prevented them from victimizing other people. The sentences they received ensured that they would be unable to continue their criminal activities for many years, and the publicity surrounding their case served as a warning to other potential victims about the sophistication of modern relationship fraud. Detective Rodriguez kept me informed about the broader impact of the case on financial crime investigation and prosecution. Your documentation methods have been adopted by law enforcement agencies in 12 states, she told me during a recent update. The techniques you use to gather evidence have become standard training for financial crime investigators. 3 years after the investigation began, I finally felt like I had fully recovered from the betrayal and moved forward with a life that was stronger and more secure than what I had shared with David. The experience had been devastating, but it had also demonstrated capabilities and resilience I hadn't known I possessed. The house in Ahwatukee was sold, with the proceeds contributing to a down payment on a smaller but more secure home in central Phoenix. The new house had enhanced security systems, both digital and physical, that reflected lessons learned about protecting oneself from people who view trust as a vulnerability to be exploited. My new life was built on foundations that were more solid than what I had shared with David. Professional success based on genuine expertise rather than marriage-based status. Financial security protected by systems I understood and controlled completely. Personal relationships based on demonstrated trustworthiness rather than assumptions and hope. The fraud detection systems I had originally designed to protect David and me had evolved into comprehensive personal security measures that I shared with other potential victims. The knowledge gained from investigating his betrayal had become expertise that protected not just me, but others who faced similar threats. Standing in my new home office 3 years after that first fraud alert had shattered my world, I reflected on the journey from victim to victor that had defined the most challenging period of my life. David and Stephanie had chosen to make me a target for their criminal conspiracy. Instead, they had provided me with the opportunity to demonstrate that financial predators, regardless of their sophistication, face serious consequences when they target someone with the knowledge and determination to ensure justice is served. The timer I had set on their downfall had run out exactly as planned. Justice had been served with the precision and thoroughness that comprehensive planning makes possible. And life had moved forward on terms that I controlled completely, protected by lessons learned and systems designed to ensure that such betrayal could never happen to me again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.